An unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Okay, well, my chapter that I'm going to talk about this morning is, of course, from the Suzuki book, Zen Mind Beginners Mind. And the name of the chapter is The Marrow of Zen. And he bases the discussion in this chapter on a Buddhist sutra called the Samyukta Agama Sutra. And this was first spoken by the Buddha himself and then translated eventually by Dogen. And it was the Dogen translation then that Suzuki picked up on. So Dean was kind enough to lend me one of the volumes of the...
Did you read it all?
No.
Not yet.
Not yet, right. From the Shobo Genzo. And it's chapter 86 in the Shobo Genzo. And I'm going to read a little bit from this because this part is not in the Suzuki lecture, but I think it's a nice backdrop to the Suzuki chapter. One day, someone outside the way asked the world-honored one, "I am not asking you for a teaching with words or a teaching without words." Then the world-honored one sat silently for some time. The person outside the way bowed and admired him. "How splendid is the world-honored one! With great compassion you have cleared out the cloud of delusion and helped me to enter realization." Then he bowed and left. After the person outside the way was out of sight, Ananda asked the Buddha, "What caused that man to say that he had entered realization and praise you before he left?" The world-honored one said, "He is like a good horse that runs upon seeing a shadow of the whip." And then it goes on to say, know that the world-honored one has two methods of guiding, noble silence and noble speech. All those who enter the way with either of these methods are like a good horse that runs upon seeing a shadow of the whip. Those who enter the way without these methods are also like this. Any questions? As is true of a lot of Suzuki's book and Zen in general, there's a lot of contradictions and paradoxes, but somehow getting to that little space between them, I think, is where we can really get some insight. He has alluded then to the horse who obeys upon just seeing the shadow of the whip. Then to go on, the four-horse metaphor describes four types of horses that are encountered in training, and they're meant to be a metaphor or an allegory to what Zen, being a student of Zen is like. So the first kind, and I will say, if you read this elsewhere or even in this book, there is a little bit of contradiction in the progression of, I shouldn't say contradiction, but inequality in the progression of what these four types are. For example, what I just read said, upon seeing the shadow of the whip, but now what is in the Suzuki book says the first kind responds if the trainer makes contact just with its hair. So it's more than a shadow, but basically they're saying a very light touch. The second type requires contact with skin. The third is contact with flesh, and the fourth with bone. So the fourth type of horse actually has to penetrate all those layers and get down to bone before it becomes aware that it should be following its owner's wish. So Suzuki says, after he provides that typology, he says, you can imagine how difficult it is for the fourth to learn how to run. And personally, I love that twist. It's like, instead of like, this is the best and this is the worst, he immediately takes us to the quote unquote worst type and elicits some kind of compassion for that poor horse that needs to be whipped to its bones just to do what it's supposed to do. So here in the relative world, we immediately apply this metaphor to ourselves and to our own practice. Which type of horse am I? Most of us, according to Suzuki, want to be the first type. And if we think we are not, what do? We aspire to achieve it. I may only be the third type now, but by gum, by this time next year, I'll be in that first class. But according to Suzuki, that kind of thinking portrays a misunderstanding of Zen. And he says, if you think the aim of Zen practice is to train you to be one of the best horses, you will have a big problem. We develop an image or an ideal that relates to our practice, and we bring this ideal to our own practice, trying to be like the first horse or the second horse or the third horse or even the fourth horse. But by comparing ourselves to some fixed idea or concept, we lose touch with the essential realm of our breath, as well as this very moment that arises without any comparisons or categories. And I think the second chant that we did today really hammered on that, which is why I chose it. If you practice Zen in the right way, it doesn't matter which type of horse you are. Practicing with an image of practice never allows us to actually touch our true self in any real way. So to reflect on Suzuki's observation that you can imagine how difficult it is for the fourth one to learn how to run, as I said, that arouses our compassion. And Suzuki also noted this, that the Buddha would have noted the difficulty that fourth type of horse has, and it would arouse his compassion and cause him to have more sympathy for the worst horse. So that's one item in favor of the fourth type of horse. Another one is, which type of horse is the best type to practice Zazen? The first, the second, the third, or the fourth? We probably immediately go to the first type and think, well, all I have to do is plop myself down and I'm there for as long as I want to be. But what Suzuki says, that the worst horse is the best horse for practice. And the reason is these imperfections that we continually are met with in doing our imperfect fourth horse type Zazen continually arise, cause great difficulties in concentration, and by doing so, they provide more meaning to the practice and are an opportunity for developing a firm, way-seeking mind. So kind of no pain, no gain kind of a thing. Not that we are trying to gain, of course. But it's like, it's like a, what is that, isometric, flexing against something that doesn't want to move. It it builds muscle. Well, it builds your practice to have to struggle and struggle and struggle. It's like in Julie's talk yesterday where she talked about, or she mentioned Suzuki's reference to a cloud or a weed in front of the moon. You don't see the perfection and the complete roundness of the moon. You don't appreciate it as much unless there's a barrier that prevents you from seeing the whole thing. If you just see the round moon, it's like, oh, there's the moon. So I think this kind of is on the same line as that principle. There's a Buddhist priest named Grace Shirison. I'd never heard of her, but she has a new book out. I haven't read it, but I found a quote from it. It's called Naked in the Zendo. And there's more to the title, but I forget what it is. It's a really long title. But she talks about this, and that's how I came upon her, because I was Googling this four-horse story to see what other people thought about it. And she said, we don't practice in order to do the rituals perfectly. We practice with exquisite attention to form so we can watch our mind, noticing our mistakes, and clinging to them in our favorite emotion. So I kind of like that. Then the next thing that Suzuki talks about in this chapter is a concept called Shoshaku Jushaku. And that is based on how we view our effort and judge its results. And he talked about students that are always ashamed when they reflect on what they are doing in their practice and in their everyday lives. You know, they're not good enough. They're not the number one horse. They haven't crossed the finish line with the blue ribbon and the blanket of red roses. And so to be wanting to attain that number one type of status, that perfect status in practice, leads to discouragement as we fall short of, of this self-imposed ideal over and over. So the term for that that Suzuki uses is this Shoshaku Jushaku, and the root word, of course, is shaku. It's in both those words. Shaku means mistake. And Shoshaku Jushaku is translated as to succeed wrong with wrong, or to succeed mistake with mistake, or one continuous mistake, which means we notice a mistake and then we ponder it and, oh, that's a mistake. Well, here's what I should do to fix it. Well, trying to fix it is putting forth effort that is yet another mistake. And then we recognize that. And so we try to fix that mistake. But trying to fix a mistake is a mistake. And it kind of reminds me of the clapper discussion we had yesterday when Aaron mentioned that he thought he hit the clapper wrong when we were doing the full moon ceremony. And what was so funny to me when I thought about that was, I know the point that you're talking about, and I thought I was talking in the wrong place. And you thought you hit the clapper in the wrong place.
It's where the little arrow goes down.
Yeah, exactly, right.
It's confusing type.
Yes, it is. But, you know, I let it go. I think you let it go too. And so we didn't follow a mistake with a mistake. We just, because it happened. And, you know, once something happens, it can't be a mistake anymore. It's out there. It's what is. So to try to roll it back or to replace it with something else is just adding mistake upon mistake. So you might be thinking, oh, okay, I need to drop this Shoshaku Jushaku way of being if I'm going to be a master. Well, actually, after he describes what this is and provides the translation, Suzuki then goes on to say that this is the characteristic of a Zen master's life: one continuous mistake. So I had a conversation with Dean about this, and Dean said, we were talking about why is that so? Why is this recognition of ongoing mistakes, replacing mistakes, why is that the way of a master? And what Dean said is because if you're not trying to be perfect, you're putting yourself in the position of having the courage to be authentic, to be who you are, do what you do, right or wrong, mistake or not, versus engaging in a drive for perfection. And as I was first reading this chapter and getting my mind around this concept, I went to a hike, a Cleveland Hiking Club hike, and it was a rainy day. And when I got there, the leader, who was one of the reasons I picked the hike, because I know his pace and his style, and I knew that I could manage it because I'm kind of recovering from some knee issues, and I didn't want to, be all in for a energetic hike. So I got there, and the hike leader, he wasn't there. He had a substitute, and she is hell on wheels. She just goes, and I was like, oh no, what am I going to do? I don't want to turn around. I'll do what happens. And then one of my hiking friends showed up, and we were kind of rolling our eyes about what are we going to do. And she proceeded to tell me about what a morning she had had. First of all, it was raining, drizzling. It wasn't horrible, but it was spitting, and she had forgotten her rain gear. And so she was out there without her rain gear. And it was colder than what she thought. And so she wasn't prepared for the temperature either. And she's telling me all this. And she was almost late because she usually went on a Monday morning to a hike that was a ways east, and she had turned east and then was like, oh no, I'm not going to that hike, am I? So she turned around and raced back to get to where the hike was. So she made a wrong turn. She thought she was going to be late. She had the wrong clothing, and it was the wrong leader. And at 9 o'clock, we took off and we hiked. And that's just what we did. That's what happened. So I was disappointed about the leader, and she was disappointed about that and many other things. But we just had a fine hike, and that's what we did. We just carried on. Some good old virya there for us. I'm remembering Suzuki's observation about the Buddha having great compassion for the hard-to-train horse. And I'm very fascinated by this concept of shoshaku, jushaku, and I Googled it, and I thought there'd be a lot, but there's really not. There's very, very few things that come up on a Google search. But one thing I found was on a martial arts blog, and it's called Elite Mental Training. And the person who wrote it, who did not put their name down, so I can't give attribution here, but he wrote, I'm assuming it was a he, wrote the whole piece on this shoshaku, jushaku in karate, which I thought was really interesting. And so here's what he said. Do not be harsh on yourself. Do not condemn yourself. Guide the mind as if it was a small child. Have patience, be mindful, be present. It does not mean an acceptance to making mistakes, but a gentle approach to dealing with your mind. In training karate, we repeat each technique thousands of times, seeking perfection, which can never be achieved. Beginners start with large, obvious mistake and strive to make the techniques better. Black belts' techniques may not exhibit external mistake, obvious to lower grades, but may be more internal, felt by the student either physically or mentally. This continuous practice is the journey of karate to black belt and beyond, and all this is shoshaku jushaku. And I really liked how he talked about a black belt. Watching a black belt, you may think that's perfection. Or going to, let's say, a Cleveland Orchestra concert. The music's perfection. There's not one note off. The timing is perfect. And yet, a trained musician, I know people who are professional musicians, and it's uncomfortable for them to listen to performance music because all they hear are the mistakes. And at least that's what they tell me. And I can't hear them, and yet they can. So the closer you get to this so-called perfection, the more mistakes you see. And as we read yesterday in the chant, Dogen's chant, if there is a hair's breadth deviation, it is like the gap between heaven and earth. So another practice that is kind of like karate in terms of it being disciplined and having discrete forms is yoga. And I practice yoga, and one of the teachers that I go to, he always says, don't make this your best pose. Make it your 10th best pose, or make it even your 20th best, because he teaches beginners yoga, right? And so we're all there like, we're going to do this one right. And he's so trained himself, he can probably see it in our actions as well as just pick up the energy in the room. And he knows we're all striving, and trying to achieve something that we couldn't achieve in 30 years. If what this karate teacher says, we'll never get there. We'll never have perfection. And then Suzuki says, by seeing our incapacity or even unwillingness to practice wholeheartedly, we feel the wish to make contact with the part of ourselves that wants and knows how to practice. In this way, our mistakes and imperfections create the basis for our firm, way-seeking mind. And then he gives an example of someone who thinks he is a good father. And he says, if someone thinks he's a good father, he's not a good father. And he said, someone who doesn't think they're a good father is a good father. And that's because recognizing that you fall short, you could always do better, you could always do more, that implies that you are aware that your behavior could be on a better level. But to make it all be about effort and some arbitrary ideal or image is a mistake. So then the last part of his chapter is what I call practice for hard times. And in this section, he makes recommendations about how to practice in difficult situations. And the first of which is if you have physical issues or pain that prevent you from sitting. And in this situation, he recommends that you sit anyway, making adjustments such as a thick cushion or a chair. And he says, even though you are the worst horse, you will get to the marrow of Zen. And that's the title of the chapter. And so that's one type of obstacle to practice is physical difficulty with actually sitting. And then he talks about the importance of practice during times of extreme mental suffering. And he gives an example of a parent whose children have a hopeless disease. And by that I think he means like are dying. And he talks about the importance of sitting and practicing in that kind of a situation. And I've been giving that a lot of thought, actually. And I thought, I don't think I've ever done that. I don't think I've ever, if I'm in a crisis, or whether it's self-manufactured or real, or in a high emotional state, it's never occurred to me to practice, so I'm kind of excited to try it. What?
You're just waiting for the right disaster.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't worry.
Yeah, it'll come, right. So what he says about that is, if you have no experience of sitting in this kind of difficult situation, you are not a Zen student. Well, that's me then. I'm the fourth horse. No other activity will appease your suffering. In other restless positions, you have no power to accept your difficulties. But in the Zazen posture, which you have acquired by long, hard practice, your mind and body have great power to accept things as they are, whether they are agreeable or disagreeable. When you are sitting in the middle of your own problem, which is more real to you, your problem or yourself, the awareness that you are here right now is the fact. This is the point you will realize by Zazen practice. Even though I haven't, as I said, I haven't, that I can remember, ever practiced during an episode of extreme duress, kind of the opposite happened to me recently. We talked about this at the Intro to Buddhism, the Jukai class, because when he said, the Zazen, which you have acquired by long, hard practice, your mind and body have great power to accept things as they are, whether they are agreeable or disagreeable. And I mentioned this in our last Jukai class, when I did encounter this this knee situation that I've developed suddenly. I've been very active all of my life, and when people encounter situations in which their ability to be active is taken from them, that's been like sort of a boogeyman phenomenon to me. It's been I can take anything, but I can't take that, and I wasn't even aware that was kind of something I was operating with. But I'd think, well, I can take financial misfortune, whatever. But I thought, I don't know what I would do if I couldn't do what I do to be active. And I couldn't do anything. I mean, I could barely bear weight. I'm a lot better now. It turns out it was arthritis. How exotic is that? But at any rate, when it happened, I met it with complete relaxation. I mean, I kept waiting, like, when am I going to go into a frenzy about this? Because it had been something I had dreaded. And I was like, well, that's how it is. That's how it is today. Maybe tomorrow will be better. If not, what am I going to do today? And I attribute that to the fact that I've done long, hard practice, because that's the only thing that's different than, let's say, if it had happened 5 years ago before I was regularly practicing. I think that is true. I guess I'll close with something that has to do with virya. I mentioned that before. Virya is effort, and there's a lot about this being the horse and wanting to be the best that implies the calling forth of effort. And in Robert Aitken's book, The Practice of Perfection, which is about the paramitas, when in his chapter on virya, he quotes one of his teachers when asked how much virya or how much effort is enough to be a good Zen practitioner. And the answer is 5% is enough.
Seems manageable.
Right. And and then he talks about this being imperfect. The comment that I mentioned that Dean made about having the courage to be authentic versus trying to be perfect, and he gives an example of having the gumption to ask a probing question in a sangha setting, even if it might be considered irrelevant or rude. And then he says the human being by nature is inadequate, practices zazen inadequately, realizes true nature inadequately. This is the virya paramita. On and on we persevere, like a small child determined to learn how to walk while continually falling down, or like a very old person getting up in the middle of the night, lurching from wall to reach the bathroom. So that's all I have. Thank you.